It's nice to be back. Monsignor Cordier was telling me it's been since April, which I cannot believe. And I've missed you. It's nice to see you again. In my role as Mission and Identity Officer at Lemoyne, I'm often asked to do invocations and benedictions and, the typical priestly things. And this past weekend, I was invited to offer a special blessing on our brand new women's softball stadium. You'd think that would be easy enough, right? I'd offer a couple remarks, a prayer, and sprinkle it with some holy water, and play ball. The thing was, as I was beginning to draft my remarks and my prayer for the event, I hit some stumbling blocks. Very easy to pray for God's blessing on this beautiful space and to pray in gratitude for all of the hands and hard work that had gone into making this possible for our women athletes. And it's very easy to pray for them, the Lady Dolphins, who have a great winning record and are terrific scholars and wonderful, I think really very generous in the community as they do service. And it's easy to pray for the fans who bring the game to life, right? But then I began to think, could I pray for the women Dolphins alone? What about their competitors? And I began to sort of think to myself, does God take sides? Right? We've all been there, right? Praying for our home team, thinking God takes our side. And I began to consider, so what logic would God be operating on to favor, the Lady Dolphins? Well, I thought to myself first, because we're a Catholic school, right? And I felt like God was shaking his head. No, we've got many Catholic school competitors. What about the fact that our women athletes are terrific scholar athletes? They keep a high GPA. They do amazing service work in the community. They bring awareness around issues like breast cancer and other issues. And then I heard God shaking his head again. So do other schools, women athletes. And then I thought to myself, but it's my school. I'm an alumnus of the college. I'm a Dolphin myself. Can't we be favorable because it's my school? Finally, I asked one of my students, who's actually a member of the softball team, and she said, Father David, you have to pray for all the women who compete on this field. After all, we're all playing on the same field. And I thought to myself, duh, right? But we get into that mentality every once in a while, don't we? We begin to think in kind of these limited, partial, self-serving, or sometimes group-serving terms. As human beings, we have a kind of perspective that is often a little on the narrow side, a little limited, and one that tries to favor our own interests. We create judgments about those who think differently than we do. We create in-groups and out-groups. And we fall into that trap eventually of a sometimes false sense of superiority, that those who are on my side are somehow better than everyone else. But clearly, we do this despite the fact that God is always reminding us, you're all playing on the same field. And it's more than whether you're rooting for the Yankees or the Mets or, God forbid, the Red Sox or SU or Georgetown, right? It's a little bit more about the way that we as human beings operate in the world related to everyone else. Now, these are hard readings. In fact, in Greek, there's an expression used for these sayings from Jesus. These are the logoi skleroi, the hard sayings. And it seems very harsh what James says in the second reading about the wealthy and the way that God is condemning the way that the wealthy fall into this trap. But I want us to think in terms of wealth as an analogy. For any good thing, anything of value. Could be knowledge, it could be power, it could be anything that gives us and those like us a sense of a certain status. And so the analogy works like this. James talks about how whether wealth is hard-won or inherited, eventually it becomes a source of security and satisfaction, but eventually a sense of that false superiority starts to come in to play, and all of a sudden those who have wealth or knowledge or power see themselves up here and everyone else down here. And that mentality then allows for us to legitimate the exploitation or the abuse of those on the other side. It becomes a matter of social justice. It becomes a matter of equality. Sooner or later, we begin to forget we're all playing on the same field. The world becomes smaller as we associate with those who are part of our group and our in-crowd, and we stop really seeing those on the outside as not only equal, but worthy of the same respect. Now, if you haven't noticed in your lifetime as a Christian, hearing the Gospels, Jesus takes a very different tact. Instead of associating with a limited small group, the whole ministry of Jesus is about constantly opening his heart to include more and more different types of people. He loves the rich and the poor. And in fact, he makes a special effort to identify and connect with those who are considered marginal. In our society, it might be the homeless. It might be people who are foreigners or who think in very different ways than we do. God forbid us crossing the Democrat or Republic line these days, right? It's very hard to begin to see that we're all playing on the same field. But Jesus, instead of upward mobility, models a kind of downward mobility. In his association with more and more different types of people, including public sinners, Jesus becomes the brother to all of us. He knows that we're all playing on the same field. So you'd think his disciples would know better when they see those riffraff acting in God's name, saying prophecies and doing healing things. They're not part of our crowd. So Jesus, you should shut them down. Protect our turf. They've clearly forgotten that we're all playing on the same field. And if you think about it, this kind of territorial or sometimes tribal way of thinking, as human as it is, it must look pretty silly in God's eyes. It must look a little bit like we're trying to play king of the hill, like children do. Does this make sense? Does this make sense? Jesus says, unless someone is obviously against us, you should consider them as on our side, right? It's so different from the other way that expression is often used. Unless someone is obviously acting as our enemy, you should trust them as a friend. Imagine how the world would change if we were less paranoid and more welcoming and trusting, even of strangers. In very hard language, Jesus says, if there is some part of you that over-identifies with one particular group to the exclusion of everyone else, whether it's your eye or your hand or your foot, whatever it is, he uses these metaphors, it's better that you should put that aside than to pursue a life that judges and divides and separates you from others. And I'm not saying we can't have fun and friendly rivalries. Of course, it's natural to root for our home team. And in fact, to say at the end of that prayer, for instance, yesterday, go Dolphins! But at the same time, as we know, good sportsmanship means that when we win, we look the other team in the eye with respect and honor and thank them for their excellence and skill because it brings the best out of us. We need to see things as wholes rather than parts, and to really trust that we are playing on the same field. So in religion, and in this season in politics, in international affairs, and in economics, we as Christians must remember, as human beings, we are not only playing on the same field, but God is not partial. His rain falls on the just and the unjust, and if anything, God has a very special love for the poor.